In 1862, a 21-year-old Scotsman, with a shy and bookish personality, physically of a delicate constitution and weak of eyesight, stepped off a ship in the town of Brisbane, capital of the newly founded colony of Queensland, Australia. Following his death 56 years later, he was described as Queensland's greatest pioneer colonist, the Carnegie of Australia, a wonderful genius, and a quiet, unassuming nation builder. This is the story of John Moffat, of Irvinebank. Moffat was born in the town of Newmilns, nestled along the banks of the Irvine River, in a picturesque rural valley of Ayrshire, Scotland, in 1841. The town's economy was sustained by thriving textile mills, and Moffat's father worked as a starcher in the textile industry. The young John Moffat learned bookkeeping and worked as a commercial clerk in Glasgow. In contrast to his hometown of Newmilns, Glasgow was a smoggy, damp city, full of heavy industry and crowded slums. Moffat suffered from poor health, and symptoms resembling asthma. It was, at least in part, for the sake of his health, that Moffat left Scotland for the newly founded colony of Queensland. Former Premier of Queensland, Sir Robert Philp, said of John Moffat, many years later,
John Moffat's assets on arriving in Queensland consisted only of a stout heart. He had a delicate constitution which happily became stronger in the fine climate and free, open life of the Queensland bush.
And into the bush Moffat did go. For some reason that can only be guessed, perhaps a sense of adventure, the shy, bookish Scot, trained for office work, chose to take a job as shepherd, at a remote outback station, Mount Abundance. Mount Abundance was situated at the very edge of the western frontier. It housed a supply store, a newly opened post office, and was a depot for explorers heading west and north into inland Australia. Perhaps the promise of decent wages helped convince the young Scotsman to make the 500-kilometre journey west. Mary McManus was 14 years old when her father, Stephen Spencer, took ownership of Mount Abundance. Reminiscing on life on the station in 1862, Mary recalled,
"These were stirring times. Wages were high, and employment of all kinds was easily obtained and well paid for."
John Moffat lived the life of a lonely shepherd, ranging far from the homestead in the untamed Australian bush, sometimes camping under the stars or sheltering in rough bush shacks. With no contact or communication for weeks at a time. Mary McManus recalled of the lives of shepherds at Mount Abundance.
Shepherds had a lonely and monotonous life. If they were married, they were more comfortable. Or if they could read, then they had some amusement in a newspaper or a novel. But there were many who could not read.
Moffat was an avid reader and roamed the bush with saddlebags stuffed full of books on philosophy, science, engineering, and theology. 2 years later, in 1864, Moffat returned to Brisbane. According to Robert Philp,
Moffat suffered from weak sight, which necessitated his wearing very strong glasses. He had to come to Brisbane to get glasses, and accepting employment with Messrs. J&G Harris, he remained with them for some years.
The brothers John and George Harris were prominent businessmen in the new colony. The firm was a shipping and import and export agency, with a wharf and warehouse on the Brisbane River, and stores in South Brisbane and Ipswich. George Harris was a member of the colony's parliamentary body, the Legislative Council. In 1866, at the age of 25, Moffat left the employ of J&G Harris to go into partnership with storekeeper Robert Love. Love and Moffat opened another store in South Brisbane that year, and another in the town of Stanthorpe in 1872. This is a rare picture of John Moffat, seen standing outside his newly opened store at Stanthorpe. Stanthorpe's main industry was tin mining, and with tin commanding high prices, the town was booming. Like other storekeepers in the town, Moffat found it good business to purchase tin concentrate from the cash-strapped miners. He could profit from trading the tin, and the miners would spend the money he gave them in his store. The tin around Stanthorpe was alluvial tin, and could be concentrated by sluicing or panning by the miners themselves. Finding the trade in tin concentrate more profitable than his trade in general merchandise, Moffat became an agent for smelters, and actively solicited for business, successfully convincing the larger, more influential mining operations to sell their ore to Love and Moffat. Not just a salesman, many of the relationships Moffat forged with these miners would last a lifetime. Moffat invested the profits he earned back into the industry, purchasing shares in promising mines and becoming a mine manager himself. At a time when tin prices were falling and competition was increasing, Moffat and his business partners established a tin smelter at Tent Hill. As Moffat concentrated his efforts in the mining industry, the firm of Love and Moffat fell into insolvency. Moffat moved to Glen Innes, where he turned his attention to developing the Boo-Rook silver mines. His former employees, William Jack and John Newell, moved to Far North Queensland. In 1879, while prospecting in the wild ranges west of Cairns, Jack and Newell discovered a tin lode they named the Great Northern. Realizing it would take considerable finance and technical know-how to exploit the potential of the field, they communicated their find to John Moffat, sending samples of ore for him to assay. The prospectors registered their claim, and in the ensuing months cut a pack track through the jungles from the present-day site of Atherton, so supplies and equipment could be brought in to develop the mine. As news of the rich lodes of tin spread, other prospectors arrived to stake their own claims on the Wild River tin field. By August 1880, 70 men were engaged in mining. However, the isolated and remote location meant that only the richest ore could be shipped for processing in distant centers at a profit. Most miners could only stockpile the ore, while waiting in hope that crushing and refining facilities would eventually arrive. Having already ordered the equipment before his departure, John Moffat arrived in the newly christened town of Herberton in October 1880. The necessary equipment arrived in batches over the next few months, and in May 1881, a 10-head stamper battery commenced crushing the rich tin ore. With the stamper mill in full operation, the population of the town quickly grew, from just 300 at the beginning of the year to around 1,000. There were 7 stores, 2 blacksmiths, 5 bakers, 2 butchers, 2 pharmacists, a shoemaker, and a soda water manufacturer.
With the advent of Mr. Moffat, the tide of prosperity began to flow,
wrote one newspaper correspondent, June 1881. John Moffat used the money he made from his investments in the Great Northern Tin Mine and Stamper Mill to buy the best tin prospects on the field. By 1882 he was expanding west of Herberton. Moffat purchased the mines around Watsonville, 7 miles to the west, and built another mill to process the ore. Having established the base metals industry in North Queensland, Moffat departed for Europe with the aim of studying the latest tin processing and smelting techniques in Cornwall and Belgium, and to purchase advanced technology and equipment. On his return in December 1883, Moffat inspected some mines recently purchased by his company 15 kilometers west of Herberton. Moffat decided to set up his headquarters there, and named the place Irvinebank, after his birthplace in Scotland. Moffat and his party lived in tents while a dam, stamp mill, and smelters were constructed. Once the industrial infrastructure to sustain mining operations was complete, Moffat then had a house built. Overlooking the waters of the dam and the mill, Moffat named his home, Loudon House, in honor of his mother's maiden name and the name of the parish in which he was born. A little town sprang up in the valley below the hill. Moffat exerted a benevolent, patriarchal influence over the town. He was the largest employer and provided financial support for community, as well as economic infrastructure. The town of Irvinebank grew over the next quarter of a century as Moffat's enterprise expanded. From his house on the top of the hill above the mill, Moffat oversaw the development of mines, processing facilities, and transport infrastructure, circulating outwards from Irvinebank, west to Chillagoe and Mungana, south to Mount Garnet, and north to Mount Carbine. Producing some of the world's purest tin ingots at his smelter in Irvinebank, Moffat extended his metallurgical mining and refining expertise to silver, copper, wolfram, and other base metals as prospectors uncovered the mineral wealth of Far North Queensland. John Moffat knew that for the true potential of the regional mineral deposits to be realized, a railway to the tin fields of Herberton and Irvinebank, the copper deposits of Chillagoe, and the gold mining districts of the Etheridge was sorely needed. The Cairns to Kuranda Railway had been built by the Queensland Government between 1886 and 1891. The government had budgeted £440,000 for the 47 miles Cairns to Herberton rail, but had spent more than £900,000 by the time it reached Kuranda, a distance of just 15 miles. In March 1892, Moffat employed surveyors to mark out a route for a 95-mile railway from Granite Creek to Chillagoe, and began to lobby the government to allow the development of a privately funded railway. 5 years later, in 1897, the Queensland Government finally granted approval for the railway to be constructed by a company formed by John Moffat in partnership with other investors. Construction of the line started in 1898, and the first 55-mile section to Lapa was completed just 2 years later. Chillagoe was reached in 1901, as was Mungana. A 32-mile branch line from Lapa to Mount Garnet was completed in 1902. And from Almaden to Mount Surprise in 1908, extending to Innesley in 1909, and Forsyth in 1911. The development of the railways attracted investments in the North Queensland mining industry, and provided a sense of stability and permanence for the pioneer settlers in the region. By 1907, Irvinebank was connected to the Chillagoe Railway by a narrow-gauge tramway. Wagons towed by 3 steam-powered locomotives, nicknamed Betty, Baby, and Old John, rattled through the hills and gullies, before winding their way beside the dam, and up around the hill, past Loudon House to a station and terminus beside the Irvinebank Company's tin mill and smelter. 1907 marked the peak of John Moffat's industrial empire, and that of Irvinebank's development. A population of around 1,500 was sustained by John Moffat's enterprises. Along with hotels, stores, and other businesses, the town had built its third and largest School of Arts hall, which housed a theatre and library. Isolated in the hilly back country in the western foothills of the Great Dividing Range, the close-knit and self-sufficient community made its own recreation. Hundreds of residents would board the trains for organized picnics at Picnic Flat, in front of the Picnic Hotel. John Moffat financially supported and participated in these community activities. It was more than a quarter of a century since Moffat had pitched his tent on the side of the hill and pronounced the name of Irvinebank. From a small mill, crushing local stone, the site had grown into a major regional production center, refining and smelting some of the best quality tin in the world. From his house on the hill, Moffat oversaw the development of other mining and refining centers covering a large area of North Queensland, eventually connected by railroads. Moffat's enterprises were not limited to the mining industry. In 1890, Moffat founded a company in partnership with William Wright Virtue to manufacture stationary engines and agricultural machinery. By the early 1900s, Moffat Virtue was a household name throughout rural Australia. But from the peak came inevitable decline. Falling tin prices, declining ore quality, and the rise of worker unions contributed to the decline in North Queensland's base metals industry. The aging entrepreneur was increasingly regarded by shareholders and business partners as old-fashioned in his management practices. Forced into retirement in 1912 at the age of 71, Moffat retired to Sydney, where he continued to promote Moffat Virtue agricultural machinery, until he passed away in 1918, at the age of 77. A simple memorial stands in front of the Irvinebank School of Arts Hall. But John Moffat's real memorial are the towns and communities that sprung up on the mining fields of Far North Queensland and still exist to this day. John Moffat's investments spurred the development of towns like Hobarton, Irvinebank, Chillago, Mount Garnet, Mount Molloy, and other centres in the mining districts. The population and industry of the inland mining districts created demand for timber, agricultural and dairy products produced on the coast and tablelands. According to historian Ruth Kerr, Moffat built up mining as the key foundation of the North Queensland economy, and Cairns and its hinterland rode on the prosperity of Moffats, or wagons.
I knew of the exceptional quality possessed by this quiet, unassuming nation builder. Simple in his habits of life, John Moffat hated affectation. He believed he had a mission in life,
said Sir Robert Philp, Queensland Premier and lifelong friend of John Moffat. And Samuel Pryor of the Bulletin wrote,
"The Carnegie of Australia has done more good for North Queensland than all the politicians of Australia."
But the greatest testimony to the character of John Moffat were the words of the children of Irvinebank, who were said to end their prayers with the words, "God bless Mum and Dad, and God bless John Moffat."